Every country on Earth is in debt. The United States owes $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. The entire planet owes $315 trillion, 3 times the size of the global economy. But here's the paradox that should terrify you. If everyone owes money, who exactly is owed? The answer isn't what you think. Because when you follow the chain of creditors, when you track who actually holds the debt, you discover something disturbing. The world doesn't owe money to anyone in particular. It owes money to itself. But 4 men, 4 bankers across 3 centuries designed it that way, deliberately. They built a system where debt can never be repaid, where governments borrow forever, where interest flows eternally upward, and where the people who design the trap profit from every payment, every crisis, every bailout. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented history. The meetings happened, the contracts exist, the mechanisms are public record, and once you see how they built it, you'll understand why $38 trillion isn't a problem to be solved. It's the system working exactly as designed. Let me show you the 4 architects, the 4 moments when the debt trap was engineered, and why every government on Earth is now caught inside it with no way out. Before 1694, kings borrowed money the old way. They'd go to merchants or nobles, promised repayment with interest, and if they couldn't pay, they'd default. Creditors lost money, kings borrowed from someone else. It was risky for lenders and embarrassing for kings, but it was contained. Debt was temporary, either repaid or defaulted. The system cleared. William Paterson changed everything. He was a Scottish merchant and financial schemer who tried and failed multiple times to get rich. In 1691, he had an idea that would reshape civilization. England was at war with France. King William III needed money desperately. The treasury was empty, tax revenue couldn't cover war costs, and traditional lenders were refusing new loans because England had defaulted before. Paterson approached the king with a proposal. He would organize a group of wealthy merchants to lend the government $1.2 million. That's about $300 million in today's money, a massive sum. But here's the innovation. The loan would never be repaid. Instead, the government would pay interest forever, 8% annually. And to manage this arrangement, Paterson proposed creating a new institution, the Bank of England. The mechanics were revolutionary. The merchant lenders would give their gold to the Bank of England. The bank would lend it to the government. The government would pay interest annually from tax revenue, and the bank would pay that interest to the merchant lenders. But here's the critical detail. The government wouldn't repay the principal ever. The loan was permanent. Why would merchants accept this? Because the interest payment was guaranteed by Parliament. It was backed by the government's taxing power. As long as England could tax its citizens, the interest would flow. And the banknotes the lenders received in exchange for their gold could be traded. They were as good as money, better than money, because they paid interest. Parliament approved Paterson's scheme in 1694. The Bank of England was chartered. The merchants provided their gold. The government got its war funding. And for the first time in history, national debt became permanent, not a problem to solve, a feature of the system. And here's what nobody explains about why this was brilliant for the bankers. The government paid 8% annually on $1.2 million. That's $96,000 per year forever. The merchants had essentially bought an annuity from the government. But Paterson's real genius was what came next. The Bank of England was given the right to issue banknotes backed by the government's debt. They could print paper money up to the value of the loan. This created money out of debt. Within 50 years, every major European power copied the model. France created the Banque Générale. The Netherlands already had sophisticated banking, but formalized government debt issuance. And by 1790, the newly independent United States adopted the same system. Alexander Hamilton, who we talked about before, explicitly modeled America's financial system on the Bank of England. Paterson died in 1719, not particularly wealthy, but the system he built persists. 331 years later, the Bank of England still exists. British government debt has never been paid off. By the early 1800s, European governments had embraced debt, but there was no organized market. Each loan was negotiated individually. Interest rates varied wildly. Nathan Rothschild changed that. He industrialized sovereign debt. The Rothschild family started as money changers and traders in Frankfurt. By 1800, the 5 Rothschild brothers had established banking houses in 5 major European cities. This network was unprecedented. They could move money across borders faster than anyone else. Nathan Rothschild in London was the strategic genius. During the Napoleonic Wars, Nathan arranged loans for Britain, but his innovation was how he structured them. Instead of lending directly to the government, he bought government bonds at a discount and resold them to investors at a markup. He created a secondary market. But here's where it gets darker. In 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, Nathan Rothschild famously learned of Napoleon's defeat before anyone else in London. His courier network was faster than official channels. He used this information to manipulate the bond market. First, he sold British bonds, signaling that Britain was losing. Prices collapsed. Other investors panicked and sold. Then, after prices crashed, Rothschild bought massive quantities at rock-bottom prices. When news of British victory arrived the next day, bond prices surged. Rothschild made millions. This established the Rothschild model: control the information, control the issuance, control the market. By 1820, the Rothschilds dominated European sovereign debt. Here's why this matters for the debt trap. Rothschild made sovereign debt tradable across borders. The web of ownership became so complex that defaulting wasn't just refusing one creditor, it was collapsing an entire international financial network. This is the Rothschild innovation. Make debt so interconnected that default becomes impossible. Governments became trapped. They had to keep paying. The Rothschild family wealth peaked in the mid-1800s. They were the richest family in the world, and that wealth came from one source: interest on sovereign debt. By 1900, America was becoming an economic powerhouse, but it still had a primitive financial system. Banks operated independently. Money supply was tied to gold. J.P. Morgan fixed that, not for the public good, to protect his banking empire. In 1907, there was a financial panic. Stock prices crashed. Banks failed. J.P. Morgan personally organized a bailout. He gathered the major New York bankers in his library, locked the doors, and forced them to pledge their own money to stabilize failing banks. It worked. But he was 70 years old, so Morgan and his associates designed a permanent solution. In 1910, Morgan's associates held a secret meeting on Jekyll Island, Georgia. For 9 days, they designed the structure of what would become the Federal Reserve System. The meetings were secret because they knew if the public found out, there would be riots. The plan was brilliant political manipulation. It wouldn't be called a central bank. It would be called a Federal Reserve System. It looked decentralized, democratic, public, but the structure ensured banker control. The regional Federal Reserve banks were privately owned by member banks, and the most important power, the power to create money, was given to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which was controlled by the largest Wall Street banks. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress in December 1913, and immediately the debt trap expanded. Now the government didn't just borrow from banks, it borrowed from the Federal Reserve, which could create money to buy bonds. Unlimited demand for government debt. This is the mechanism that enables infinite debt. The Federal Reserve ensures there's always a buyer for government bonds. The debt trap became infinite. By the 1970s, the debt trap was reaching its limits until Paul Volcker made it permanent. Volcker was Federal Reserve Chairman from 1979 to 1987, and he faced a problem. Inflation was over 10%. So in 1979, Volcker raised interest rates dramatically to 20%, the highest in American history. This crushed inflation, but it had another effect. Developing nations had borrowed billions. Now those loans were due and the interest rates had tripled. Mexico owed $80 billion. In August 1982, Mexico announced it couldn't make payments. This should have triggered global financial collapse. American banks had lent most of that money. Volcker could have let it happen, but he didn't. Instead, he orchestrated a bailout through the International Monetary Fund. The IMF would lend Mexico enough money to keep making interest payments to American banks. The loans were called structural adjustment loans, and they came with conditions. Governments had to cut spending, privatize state assets, basically dismantle their economic sovereignty. This pattern has repeated for 40 years, every time the same structure: austerity imposed, sovereignty surrendered, and the debt never eliminated, just restructured, made perpetual. Now, let me show you how these four architects built a system where debt is infinite and escape is impossible. Start with Paterson's model, add Rothschild's innovation, add Morgan's mechanism, add Volcker's trap. The result is what we have today: 315 trillion in global debt. None of it will ever be repaid. All of it pays interest. It's a transfer from workers to capital every year forever. It's the largest wealth transfer in history, continuous, structural, and invisible. And here's who profits: the institutions that hold the debt. BlackRock, Vanguard. They collect the interest, from taxpayers to bondholders. The debt trap is complete. An escape isn't possible, not without collapsing the entire financial system. 4 architects, 3 centuries, 1 system. If these changed how you see government debt, subscribe if you want to understand how the machine was built. Debt isn't a problem, it's the foundation, and interest is the rent we pay to live in their world.